Hello folks, I'm Alex, this is Alex Unabridged, and these are my thoughts on Cage of Souls by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So welcome back to the channel if that is the case. Yes, another Adrian Tchaikovsky book read by me. This was a little bit of an impromptu read. I hadn't planned on that this month, but I was casting around on Audible Plus catalogue and noticed that some of the Adrian Tchaikovskys that have been on there for a while were about to disappear at the end of the month, the 25th of October, and Cage of Souls was one of them. And it had been on my list as one to look at in the future, but I thought I'd better jump on this now whilst I've got access to it as part of my subscription. So I decided to dive in to the audiobook of this. This is essentially an account of the life of Stefan Advani, who is a social historian, an outcast, a prisoner now, as told by the man himself, Stefan. And it starts with his journey on board a boat to an island prison in a jungle where he's been sentenced to life imprisonment. There is no other sentence available for any prisoners, and you are lucky if you last that long at the prison anyway. It's pretty grim. And we hear about his time there at the prison, as well as his past, his upbringing and his education. He's an educated man, a scholar, in the city of Shadrapar, which is the last city on a dying earth. We hear about his adventures in the desert, his time in the underworld, where the outcasts and criminals live, as well as his encounters in the very strange jungle that surrounds the island prison, which is full of strange and terrifying creatures. And it's told very much as a sort of a memoir. I'd certainly class it as science fantasy rather than straight science fiction. What did I make of this then? This is very messy. The plot, what there was of it, is all over the place. I never knew where it was going, where the hell the story was going to end up. There are a discombobulating number of characters in it. It probably could have been maybe 100 pages or more shorter, but I loved every minute of it. There is so much to this book. It's hard to know where to start, to be honest. I say there are a ton of characters. We get to know a handful of them pretty well through Stefan's account. Stefan being the most detailed one, of course, seeing as it's him telling us the story. I really liked him. He's a very flawed character. He's somewhat superior, although he does kind of learn the error of his ways a little as we go on. He's totally not a hero, that's for sure. He kind of talks about how he's survived really by virtue of luck, of not being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because his account of some of the stuff in the book, therefore, is somewhat second-hand, because he wasn't actually there at some of the events he describes, he is somewhat of an unreliable narrator. But he is quite charming in a lot of ways. He's funny, and he has his good sides. He does have doing good kind of, or making things better, making the world a better place, kind of at his heart, even if some of his ideas of how are a little, misguided at times. But I really liked him. I thought he was a great narrator character, and the way that he frames the world is really interesting. A lot of the characters don't really have a huge amount of purpose beyond adding kind of flavour to the story, or as a vehicle for Tchaikovsky to kind of discuss a certain element of human behaviour or thought or kind of, part of society. some other idea. But the majority of them, the vast majority of them, were memorable. They were kind of larger than life. They were entertaining, or they were loathsome, and added some really good conflict and tension to the book. I think the world of the book is probably one of my favourite things about it. As I say, it's a far future kind of dying version of our Earth, but you wouldn't know it, I think, when you start it. It's kind of unrecognisable. It's that far future and that different. But it's really intriguing. And I spent quite a bit of time sort of postulating, if you like, over some of the things that Stefan talks about, and what they could be in terms of how are they linked back to our Earth, what we know, of our present situation on the planet. So yeah, that was really interesting. The prison itself, and a lot of the world, to be fair, but the prison itself particularly, is super grim, both in terms of the physical reality of it, where it is, the sort of living conditions, if you like, and in terms of the treatment that the prisoners receive there, particularly at the hands of the marshal, who's kind of the head of the wardens, and some of his wardens as well are not particularly nice characters. The marshal is a particularly despicable character. He kills prisoners kind of wantonly, for sport, really. Give him any excuse and he'll kill. And he holds order above all else. He really values order and discipline and power. He is a power crazy little psychopath, really. And he fills both the prisoners and the wardens with terror, and those bits are particularly tense with the marshal. What is he going to do next? He's very unpredictable. The areas of the jungle around the prison island are really, really hostile, filled with really strangely evolved creatures, and some other rather less hostile kind of sentient beings, but that's all I'll say, because otherwise it'd be a spoiler. And we get these little expeditions from the prison, with the prisoners, off into this area, or at least into the waters that sort of surround the island and border the jungle. And so we get to know a little bit more about the jungle. In fact, I would have loved to have seen this explored further. This was an area that I really, really enjoyed. Learning about kind of the sort of things that lurk in the water, that lurk in the jungle, that kind of thing. But there's so much else in this book that, it was contained. There is a decent amount, but I think that's the sort of area where I really would have liked to have, gone into more detail. Then we've got places like Shadrapar, the grand but dying city, which has all the inequalities that you'd kind of expect. There's plenty of sort of political game playing, scapegoating, corruption, that kind of thing. And then you've got the underworld, with a capital U, which is, under the city of Shadrapar, which is where all of the outcasts, misfits, those on the run from the authorities, that's where they all live. And, there's a faction system there and bartering, and it's a whole other society on its own. And so we kind of get sections where we're in the underworld with Stefan, when it's, we're learning about his past before he was sent to prison. And we get, to sort of experience explorations into sort of the deep world underneath the underworld, called the depths, when Stefan goes on expeditions with one of the factions there. And that's, I would have liked, again, that's another area where, although there's a decent amount of it, I still would have liked to have known more. This is kind of where, in the depths, there's kind of ancient ruins of previous civilizations and kind of old technologies, things like that, along with some rather horrific sort of denizens of the depths, which are again, hostile and quite scary. So yeah, that's another area where I was fascinated, but I would have liked to have known more. As I say, that's kind of those are the major locations, but there's more. There's the desert as well, and all the strange ruins and creatures in the desert. Um, and we get, as I say, snippets of this through Stefan's accounting. And I loved them all, but I think I would have liked to have seen more of some of them for sure. I think, one of the flaws, if you like, of this book is that it spreads itself very wide. And yes, it's long, and it could have been shorter, but it does spread itself around a lot, and so you don't get the real detail that you do if you just focus on sort of one or two areas. Um, the writing is where this absolutely shines for me, and the reason why I enjoyed it so much, for sure. Because there's a lot of things about this book in terms of its kind of the way it bounces around, past and present, and certainly in terms of its sort of plot or lack thereof, and the amount of characters and the amount of stuff in it that isn't really kind of, it doesn't drive towards an end goal. It's anecdotal. It's kind of here, there, and everywhere, and some of it is just, you know, it serves its own purpose. It doesn't have a purpose in the greater story. That kind of thing can sometimes annoy the hell out of me, but it didn't in this. Um, Tchaikovsky's writing style I already knew that I really liked, and this is no different. Um, the humour in it is something that I've come to, and the humour in his writing generally is something that I really value. It's my kind of humour. There's sharpness to it, there's sarcasm for sure, there's a darkness to some of the humour, and there's just a real silliness and absurdity to a lot of it. There were several sections in this which had me laughing out loud, and one that had me in tears. Um, and I definitely appreciate that, especially when a lot of it is quite grim. It is quite dark in terms of the prison environment. That kind of black comedy, or sometimes that absurd comedy, really just helps me not get too sort of dark in the mind as well with the darkness that's going on in the book. As I say, it is grim though, and I do like that. And certainly when it comes to something that's a bit more fantastical, grim is good for me. There is a melancholy note to it in a lot of it though as well, as Stefan kind of realizes how grim things are in terms of not just his position in the prison, but also just the state of the world. The fact that the earth is dying, that things are changing and not for the better, and the kind of the need, the urge to want to do something to save the world, but not being able to do that. Um, that does lend a kind of quite a sad tone to some of it, but it's written beautifully, so it's not mawky, I think is the word I'd use, but it fits well. It's another sort of quality to the writing that makes it varied, that made me want to kind of keep reading. There's some great action in it as well. Some sections possibly where there's some battles, maybe a little overwritten, kind of go on a little bit too long, but not to the point where I ever got bored with it or anything like that. I think the fact that it is Stefan's account is what makes this so enjoyable. It is told in his voice. It reads kind of like a Victorian adventure novel. There is a very Victorian feel to the way this is told, and to the kind of human elements of the world. You've got things like flintlock pistols, you've got older weapons, older kind of systems. There's a real kind of, in some respects, there's quite a steampunky vibe to it, especially when it comes to the science fiction and fantasy weapons. And again, that's not something generally that I would look for. Although I do like people like Jules Verne, and there is an element of that to it. But it does kind of read in a very kind of classic style in some respects. It's also like Stefan is inherently kind of upbeat. in the way that he tells the story, which is a really interesting kind of it's really interestingly offset against the, as I say, the grimness of the world and the grimness of his situation and the world's situation. I wouldn't have thought it'd necessarily work, but actually it works beautifully. And I will say that, like, I had this on audio, obviously, and I think the narrator helped massively with that. The narrator, I think it was David Thorpe, the way that he reads this in Stefan's voice, and he does, you know, some quite over the top but highly entertaining voices for some of the other characters. That really helped with it. It was fantastic. But yeah, there is a definite sort of Victorian adventure feel to it, and some kind of almost Victorian kind of gothic stuff to it. There's kind of characters in it that are all kind of reminiscent of sort of Frankenstein's monster and things like that. There's a lot of different elements coming in that give it this very particular feel. The plot then, what plot? There is an overarching kind of plot, but it's very difficult to pin down, I think, until the end. It's more really a series of stories. It's anecdotes, recountings of events that Stefan wants to give us. He says that this is not a complete account. He has missed things out. He's exaggerated things or elevated things to a kind of an importance that they may not hold for other people, for instance, things like that, hence the unreliable narrator. But it is an account of his life and what he thinks and what he deems, kind of important. And through that, we get how the earth and society are dying. As I say, the plot meanders through these various different stories, different times in Stefan's life. It bounces between past and present, although it's very well kind of laid out where we are and when, etc. It's very clearly telegraphed in the chapter titles, for instance, or the parts. But yeah, that it is largely, kind of a series of connected stories and anecdotes, a history, a personal history. But because of Adrian Tchaikovsky's writing and the voice that he uses with Stefan, they were never boring to me. They were always really interesting. They were always funny, as I say, tense, expanded a bit of the world, expanded a bit of the characters, that kind of thing. It really just kind of expanded on the vibes of the whole book. There's a lot of ideas in this. We'd be here forever if I went through every single one. Again, like the world, none of the ideas are really, really fleshed out. It's more that Tchaikovsky's kind of asking a ton of questions for the reader to kind of like think about. I appreciate that. I do appreciate that. I like lots of ideas, lots of questions being thrown at me. But again, it might have been good to have some discussions go into a bit more depth. But I mean, he looks at elements of sort of sociology, politics, corruption, inequality, power, education, evolution. It's not surprising. That's something that Adrian Tchaikovsky seems to keep returning to. It's one of his favourites. Ecology, kind of eco-politics and climate, things like that. There's also plenty in here in terms of philosophy and kind of the different ways that people view the world and how they think, one can make a difference in the world. As I said before, I enjoyed pondering kind of the ideas of how the Earth of Cage of Souls relates to our current Earth. How did it, how in Tchaikovsky's mind did it get to that? So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this. I would say I loved this. It is not my usual thing at all, but Tchaikovsky has done it again and sucked me into this. It is very much a kind of a vibes versus plot book. Don't go in expecting a clear plot. It is a series of stories and anecdotes and characters that all add up to create this atmosphere, this kind of account of this dying earth, all through the eyes of one man, really, with some second-hand accounts from others and his relationship with other people. I didn't know when I started it what I was gonna get. I got something very, very different to the Children of Time series. And it kind of amazes me the kind of the shift that Tchaikovsky can make from one voice to another, if you like, one world to another. It's like they are vastly different, but there are all of the hallmarks of his writing that I love in here, absolutely. So for a rating then, I will pop my rating up on screen. The individual categories. Character, I've given it an 8. Lots of characters, all of which were enjoyable, most of which were memorable, and the core group, if you like, of a handful of characters we get to know throughout, including Stefan, were, I thought, excellent. I really liked them. Atmosphere and world building, I've given a 9 to. Yeah, fascinating. Wish it could have been just expanded, elements of it could be expanded on a little more. But it really did its job in terms of providing sort of the vibes, the overall vibes of what this world is. And yeah, it's one that, you know, it left me wanting more. So if Tchaikovsky was to ever return to this world, this earth, I'd definitely be up for learning more. Writing, I have given a 9 to. The only thing that marks this down is I do think that sections of it are a little overwritten. It could have been a little bit shorter if you just cut out even some of the action, really. As I say, some of the action sequences for me went on a little long, and there's just maybe a little too much waffle in some sections. But none of it ever lost me. None of it ever like bored me or anything like that. But yeah, I just think it could have been shaved down a little bit. Plot, I've given a 6 to. It doesn't, as I say, the plot is not the main focus here. It's not necessarily what I would go for, but it's still decent, the overarching plot, but that's not what it's about. It is about the atmosphere and character and stuff like that. Ideas, I've given it an 8. Wish some of them could have been expanded on a little more, but I do value the fact that there are a lot of ideas in there and it gave me a lot of things to ponder. And my enjoyment is a 9. Yep, loved this one. Nowhere near as much as Children of Time, or even Children of Ruin, but I definitely think that it's up there with Children of Memory for me. I definitely would say it's probably a similar level of enjoyment, and I loved that as well. But yeah, I had a great time with this. I got a lot out of this. Okay, so if I add all of those scores up and divide by 6, we get an 8.17 out of 10. I will round that down to an 8 out of 10. And this will go on the story graph at a 4-star rating. So another hit for me from Adrian Tchaikovsky. I have to admit, I think I am hooked on his writing. I've not felt this way about an author since I started reading lots of Stephen King back in my teenage years and just wanted to read everything. And I'm kind of feeling the similar way about Tchaikovsky, certainly at the moment. I know there'll be books that won't do it for me. But so far, he's, 5 out of 5. So I'm going to continue on with getting through some of his back catalogue. The next one of his that I will read will be in November. I'm going to be doing Novelisation and Tie-In Tember, which is hosted by the fabulous Andrew at It Came From The Page. I will link in the description to Andrew's announcement video in case anybody's interested in the event. But one of the prompts for that is to read a book based on a tabletop game. Well, that's got to be Warhammer for me. It's got to be a Warhammer book. And who'd have thought it, but Adrian Tchaikovsky has written a Warhammer book. It's called Day of Ascension. So that's the one I will be listening to. It's an audiobook, listening to in November. And then I think I will probably try and do one in December as well. Probably The Doors of Eden. I've got that one and I'm really intrigued by that. But Alien Clay is also quite high up on the priority list of things of his to read. So we'll see. But I'm going to get through all of them eventually. I know that he is one that I will continue to read, even when I get one which doesn't agree with me, or I don't like so much. He's just one that I just want to see, what he comes up with next. So that's enough waffle from me today, I think. Thank you very much for watching, folks. As always, do drop your thoughts in the comments below. Have you read Cage of Souls? Did you enjoy it as much as me, or is it a little plotless and verbose for your liking? I will be back on Sunday with my ranking of the 20 Stephen King novels that I've read so far. I've been thinking of doing this for a while, and then my buddy Troy, Mr. Troy Tradup, dropped his top 10 King novels list the other day. So I've got to respond to that, really, haven't I? So we can compare notes or argue about each other's rankings, things like that. So I hope you'll join me for that on Sunday. But from me, for now, that's ta-ra.